The Detroit riots of 1967 were one of the most destructive and violent riots of U.S. history. At the end of it all, 342 people were injured while 43 people had lost their lives. About 1,400 buildings had been destroyed, and nearly 7,000 National Guard and other armed forces were called into Detroit by the end of the riots. It all started in the summer of 1967, deemed the Summer of Love, due to the unprecedented gathering of around 100,000 young people, known as hippies, on the Haight-Ashbury neighborhood located in San Francisco. While many other states had random gatherings, San Francisco was the biggest because it was the center of the hippie revolution. This was due to the immense melting pot of music, drugs, creative freedom, and politics. This summer became a defining moment for the hippie revolution because it was when they finally were moved into public notice. But the summer of '67 was not all love in other parts of the US. Peace rallies and war protests were occurring all over the states because of the Vietnam War taking place overseas. Also during this time, one of the largest riots in American history had taken place, the Detroit Riots. The Detroit Riots were not the first to take place. Many other states had race riots of their own, including New York, Illinois, and Ohio. These were mainly started by the racial tension being built up in these cities. While this was the same case for the Detroit riots, none of the riots compared to the size and destruction that occurred in Detroit. On the morning of Sunday, July 23rd, a group of Detroit police officers raided an unlicensed drinking club above the Economy Printing Company. As the police walked into the club, they were greeted by the overwhelming amount of people inside. 82 people were celebrating the return of two locals coming home from the Vietnam War. Not knowing what to do, they arrested everybody present. A large crowd of onlookers shortly began to grow during the arrests. After the police had left, the crowd of onlookers began to loot a close-by clothing store. Shortly after this had occurred, full-scale looting had taken place throughout the neighborhood. Since it was a Sunday morning, there were not many police around to contain the riot. Those who were there, however, believed they would die down quickly, just stood there and watched. Police did not make their first arrest until 7 a.m. As more police gathered, they conducted sweeps to try and disperse the crowds. These proved to be ineffective because of the unexpected amount of people outside in the crowds. The local news avoided reporting on the subject at hand so they would not inspire copycat riots. The Wayne County Sheriff's Department and Michigan State Police were called to help with the immense amount of rioters. As the chaos ensued, police began to make more and more arrests to clear the streets. At the end of the day, there were around 480 fires and 1,800 arrests. Looting and arson was getting a lot more widespread as black-owned businesses were not spared. As the firefighters were trying to remove the fires, they were being shot at by the rioters. During the riots, 2,498 rifles and 38 handguns were stolen. Around midnight, President Johnson allowed the use of federal troops. Even though troops were present, chaos would not stop in the city. Many of the arrests were due to the curfew violations and, of course, rioting. Detroit police were accused to have committed many acts of abuse against both black and whites. Women were stripped and fondled while the officers took pictures. It was a horrid sight in Detroit. The deployment of troops was supposed to have violence die down, but it in fact increased it. Tanks and machine guns were used to try and control the crowds as well. Rioters were protected by the Michigan Civil Rights Commission due to the fact that most, if not all, Michigan National Guard was white and did not have urban backgrounds. Sufficient order had returned to Detroit. The National Guard removed all ammunition from the station areas and were ordered to sheath their bayonets. After all the rioting and looting in Detroit, racial tensions had remained the same, if not gotten worse. It was estimated that around 10,000 people had participated in the riots and around 100,000 people gathered to watch. These riots that took place throughout the U.S. in 1967 will always be a staple in American history. One, however, will always come to mind when the word riot is mentioned. Detroit is known for a lot of good things, including the Ford Motor Company, the DIA, and the Woodward Dream Cruise, but the riots of '67 will never be forgotten.